The sky was deceptively calm that Sunday morning, February 11th, 1979. Hana, a small, tight-knit town on the eastern edge of Maui, had barely stirred awake. Palm trees stood still, the ocean looked inviting, and on the surface, everything seemed normal. But the sea has a way of lying. 5 men walked toward the docks that morning, all local boys or longtime residents. Friends, brothers, in every way except blood. They were young, ranging from their late teens to early 30s, and they'd grown up with salt water in their veins. Fishing, diving, surfing, sailing, it was second nature. They respected the ocean, but they didn't fear it. The boat was small, just a 17-foot Boston whaler named Sara Jo. No cabin, no long-range gear. The kind of boat you take out for a few hours, not a journey. That morning, they were supposed to be out for just that. An hour, maybe 2, to cast a few lines. A relaxing cruise, no big plans. They didn't even file a float plan, because why would they? It was supposed to be routine. The men were Benjamin Kalama, 38, Ralph Maliachini, 27, Patrick Wessner, 26, Peter Hanchett, 31, and Scott Moorman, 27, a mix of native Hawaiians and locals who had made Hawaii home. Scott had been born in California, but he'd lived in the islands for years and had fallen in love with the way of life. The others knew the waters intimately. They'd grown up in Hana. They had every reason to believe they'd be back before lunch. But by early afternoon, the weather turned, and fast. Trade winds, those infamous sudden bursts of Pacific fury, picked up without much warning. By 1:30 p.m., gusts were measured at over 40 knots. A small craft advisory was issued, but by then, it was too late. The Sara Jo was already out to sea. The ocean went from tranquil to terrifying in under an hour. Locals on shore watched in mounting concern. The wind was screaming. Waves rose, visibility dropped. The men were gone. At first, nobody panicked. They were seasoned. Strong swimmers, good with a boat. Maybe they'd turned around and landed somewhere else. Maybe they found a cove or an inlet. Maybe they were even camping, waiting for the weather to settle. That night, families stayed hopeful. By the next day, when no one had heard from any of the 5, the fear kicked in. Calls were made. Helicopters scrambled. The U.S. Coast Guard launched an extensive search and rescue operation across hundreds of square miles. Boats, aircraft, radar, and local fishermen joined the effort. For 9 days, the Pacific was combed. Nothing, not a single shred of wreckage. No distress signal, no life jackets, no sightings. It was as if the Sara Jo had been plucked off the face of the earth. On February 20th, 1979, the official search was called off. The families were shattered. Hana mourned, but without closure, the grief felt unfinished. The sea had taken something, but had offered no explanation in return. Over time, people moved on. The men's names were etched in memory and prayer, and the Sara Jo joined a long list of maritime disappearances that haunt island communities. Years passed. Then a decade. In 1988, something happened. On a remote, uninhabited speck of coral called Taongi Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands, 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, marine biologist John Naughton was conducting a research survey. Taongi was untouched, rarely visited, almost mythic in its isolation. No permanent inhabitants, no infrastructure, no reason anyone would ever end up there by accident. And yet, there it was. Half buried in the sand and coral was a small, rotting boat. Faded, battered, barnacle-encrusted. It looked like it had been there for years. Curious, Naughton and his team examined it. The nameplate was gone, but the registration number on the hull was still legible. When they got back to Honolulu, they ran the number. It was the Sara Jo. People were stunned. The wreck was verified, confirmed, and authenticated. The boat that had vanished in a storm 10 years ago in Hawaiian waters had somehow made its way across the ocean to one of the most desolate points in the Pacific. And then came the second discovery. Roughly 100 yards from the boat, partially obscured by vegetation and coral, was a grave. A small, carefully constructed grave. It had been made with purpose. Layers of coral placed neatly around the perimeter, with a driftwood cross stuck at the head. Inside, buried shallowly, were human remains. Dental records confirmed it was Scott Moorman. He was the only one of the 5 ever found. There were no signs of trauma, no bullet wounds, no blunt force injuries, no indication of foul play. And yet there was no note, no clue, just a body, buried with respect, with care. Someone had made sure he was not left to rot in the sun. But who? And why hadn't they stayed? Forensic examination of the boat raised even more questions. The coral growth and marine life patterns on the hull suggested the boat had only been on Taongi for a short time, maybe a few months. It hadn't been drifting for 10 years. It had been somewhere else. That shattered the original theory that the Sara Jo had simply floated its way across the Pacific for a decade and landed by chance. It meant the boat may have made landfall much earlier, on a different island, maybe hidden in a cove, maybe even maintained. It also suggested someone might have been alive with the boat long after the storm. But if so, where had they gone? And what had they lived through? The burial, too, was strange. Experts couldn't tie the style to any local tradition, not Polynesian, not Micronesian, not Marshallese. It looked improvised, almost ritualistic. The placement of coral was unusually precise. Someone had taken their time. If Scott had survived long enough to reach the island, had he died alone? If not, who buried him? And where were the other 4? Peter, Patrick, Benjamin, Ralph? Not a trace of them was ever found. No skeletal remains, no personal items, no notes, no evidence. They vanished into the ether. In the years that followed, theories bloomed, and none of them brought peace. One posited that the men made it to another island first, perhaps inhabited, perhaps not. They may have survived for months, even years. Maybe they were rescued by a fishing trawler or a passing freighter. If it was a legal vessel, why didn't they report it? If it wasn't, if it was a black market ship, a spy vessel, or something darker, what happened then? There were rumors, always. Whispers of foreign intervention, Cold War secrecy, ghost stories, but nothing stuck. No governments confirmed any contact, no records surfaced. Some believe the men simply starved or succumbed to exposure, that only Scott survived long enough to reach Taongi, that he died there alone, and the grave, well, maybe he built it for himself, knowing the end was near. But how does a man dig his own grave so carefully? Others believe more than one survived, and one of them buried Scott. Maybe the others tried to sail on. Maybe they fell victim to the sea again, or died on another island, unknown and unclaimed. Some even believe, quietly, almost superstitiously, that they were never meant to be found, that the ocean keeps what it wants. But perhaps the most unsettling theory of all is this, that someone survived for years, that one or more of the men built a life in isolation, and that when the end came, they buried their friend and sailed away again, only to vanish for good. There was no sign of shelter on Taongi, no tools, no fire pits, no personal effects, just the boat and the grave. The Sara Jo wasn't just lost, it was edited, a ghost ship, stripped of narrative, returned just enough to haunt. Families tried to find closure, but it never came. Scott Moorman's parents had him buried in a proper grave. The others erected memorials. Some of the men had young children when they disappeared. Those kids are grown now and still wondering, still looking across the waves. Every so often, new tips come in. a man who looks familiar on a dock in the Philippines, a scrap of boat found in Micronesia, a whisper of a castaway seen on a remote island, but they always lead to nothing, always end in silence. The vanishing of the Sara Jo is more than a maritime mystery. It's a story about the limitations of human understanding, about how 5 men can disappear in broad daylight, about how a boat can reappear thousands of miles away a decade later, about how closure isn't something you always get, and about how the sea doesn't always give back what it takes. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.